Harry the Hammer with further review by Housecrafters. Housecrafters provides complete home renovation services with one call does it all. That includes exterior home services like roofing, siding, home additions, and much more. Call 716-646-NAIL.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Further Review podcast here at BuffaloNews.com. I am Jay Skursky, joined by Katherine Fitzgerald and Lance Lysowski, my colleagues on the Bills beat. Katherine and Lance, let's get right to it. A very busy day for us here in Buffalo and Western New York with the news that after 9 seasons, Sean McDermott has been fired as head coach of the Buffalo Bills by team owner Terry Pegula. Katherine, I'll start with you. Your initial reaction to the news.
I am surprised by the news. I think especially when you pair it with the promotion of general manager Brandon Beane. As we sit here today, Beane is going to help oversee the coaching search. He's now president of football operations, and the coaching staff will report to him, which is different than the previous structure under the Bills. I think if you had asked me if one or the other was going to be fired, I would have guessed Beane over McDermott, so I'm a little surprised by this.
Lance, you hustled together a great column, which is already available on BuffaloNews.com with your complete thoughts. But if you could just kind of verbalize those for us, where you went with that column, and same question that I posed to Katherine, your initial reaction to this news.
Nobody was going to be able to predict what Terry Pegula was going to do, how he would react to the Bills' latest playoff loss. You got the sense, though, over the last few months, whether it be some of Sean McDermott's comments, the way the team played, you just knew something was going to happen. There was going to be a hammer to drop if this team lost in the playoffs before the Super Bowl, another playoff disappointment. Yeah, I mean, I sort of echo Katherine's thoughts that you did wonder if it was going to be Brandon Beane, because Sean McDermott, I thought that he did a really strong job this season, guys, considering the injuries on the roster, some of the curveballs he added to the defense to try to get the most out of his players, the whole Darius Slay fiasco, all of that, the wide receiver problem. And I think just from the outside, it was difficult for a lot of people, myself included, admittedly, to diagnose who really had a say or influence on certain issues with this roster and some of the problems that happened with this team throughout the season. In the end, though, you knew that Pegula was going to do something. Brandon Beane, he found the quarterback, right? Terry Pegula is betting on the guy who found him, Josh Allen, who's hired a scouting staff, who's found a lot of mid to late round gems in the draft. And they have to feel very confident with this coaching cycle, having as many strong candidates that it does, that you can find somebody who can work in lockstep with the general manager. Surprising news, but in the end, I did expect some kind of significant change because Josh Allen's going to be 30 at the start of next season, guys. I know he's not 40. Same token, though. There has to be a certain level of urgency. What about you, Jay?
Yeah, well, before I answer, Katherine, I'll just kind of volleyball it back over to you here as I play point guard. But do you agree with Lance's, kind of read of the situation there, that you felt like a change like this was coming in either of the positions, Beane or McDermott?
That's a great question. I wasn't sure there was going to be a change just based off Terry Pegula in the past. That's why I, said previously if I had to have guessed one or the other, but that's because I didn't think either would be fired. My opinion, based off how Pegula has operated. I know it's different than how he runs the Sabres, obviously, but, he's been able to wait certain things out for a while. And I was surprised that, especially seeing how Beane and McDermott had been extended in tandem, worked in tandem, I thought Terry was going to continue with both of them. So that's where my surprise came from more, just thought there was any move at all.
Yeah, Lance, and I'll throw it back to you in a minute here. And I'm interested to get your take as someone who covered the Sabres for the Buffalo News before coming over to the Bills, because you have not been a stranger to, coach changes, head coach, GM changes, or I guess the clamoring for GM changes over the last couple of years that Pegula was, quite frankly, slow to make. And it wasn't until very recently that he let go of Kevin Adams. And I think that's where some of the surprise comes in, is that, the Bills had this thing figured out in the sense of terrific regular season success, a run of 5 straight division titles that was ended this year by the Patriots. to make the divisional round of the postseason, one of 8 teams left in the NFL for 6 straight years, is no small accomplishment. It's not easy to do. That said, if we are looking at a reason that we're having this conversation and hosting this podcast today, it's because that playoff success had a ceiling on it, and the ceiling was the AFC Championship game. And when you have Josh Allen, the reigning MVP, the thought process goes that, they have underachieved in the postseason. And Sean McDermott came to Buffalo as a defensive-minded head coach. He was the Carolina Panthers defensive coordinator for 6 years when the Panthers went to the Super Bowl. Prior to that, had worked under Andy Reid in Philadelphia, most lately as the defensive coordinator there as well. And in those 6 playoff losses, divisional games, the Bills have given up at least 27 points in each of them and an average of 33 points. That is unacceptable, and I think it's a big reason why we're having the conversation that we are having today, because that has been the side of the ball far too often that has, I think, primarily led to the early playoff exits. Now, again, there are a lot of different directions that we can go. There are a lot of truths in this. You can point at that and say Sean McDermott did not tell Josh Allen to turn the ball over 4 times in Denver on Saturday. And you can point out that Sean McDermott and the offensive coaching staff watched as Allen has had the ball 3 times in the last 3 years with a chance to score the go-ahead or tying points in a game, and has been unable to do that. So to excuse the offense of any blame here, I think is a mistake. But McDermott is on his fourth offensive coordinator, right? Rick Dennison, and then Brian Daboll leaves. Ken Dorsey is in the job. Joe Brady is in the job. So there have been a lot of changes amongst the staff, particularly on offense. He's changed special teams coordinators. Lance, earlier you brought up a really interesting point in terms of Bean, and we can get into this a little bit more in our second segment, but we don't truly know, right, in terms of roster construction, who wanted what player, right? Who wanted a certain player, how much influence McDermott had in the draft room, how much influence McDermott had in free agency. Terry Pegula, though, is sending a message today in making this move that he believes that McDermott was given the tools to succeed and to take the team where it ultimately needs to go and wants to go with Josh Allen, and that he primarily was unable to do that. I think time will tell if that's the right decision, but I want to circle back, Lance, to the question that I was going to ask you. Given your prior experience covering the Sabres and, the, I think, sheer unpredictability that comes with Terry Pegula in terms of coaching moves and front office moves, to me, that stands out as maybe the biggest surprise in all of this because, as I said, they had a structure that worked here in Buffalo, at least in terms of regular season success, of postseason berths. These guys were adults in the room. They brought a credibility and built a culture, quite frankly, in Buffalo that did not exist before they got here. And it will be interesting to see where that goes from here with Sean McDermott no longer overseeing it.
Yeah, and this shows me, Jay, that Terry Pegula feels confident about the people that he's including in this search. You think back to Rex Ryan on the Bills side, Ralph Kruger with the Sabres. Those two were salesmen. They got Terry Pegula in a room. They sold him on this big idea that they were going to fix these teams, and Terry made a mistake by hiring both of those coaches, undoubtedly. Now, with a general manager that he clearly has built a very strong relationship, Pete Goelli, the COO, don't underestimate his importance in terms of the way this search is going to go. Terry feels like he has the right team in place to help him find the right coach. And I completely agree with you. This is about the defense. It really is. I know that one playoff loss, Josh Allen and the offense turned the ball over 5 times in Denver. Undoubtedly, they probably win that game if it does not happen. But I also look at the scheme that Sean McDermott runs. And he is a football coach who is, I want to say, stubborn. He's set in his ways. He's a very specific vision of the structure of his defense, the types of players that have to fit an exact. He has a very specific vision for safeties, linebackers, defensive linemen, and he's unwavering in that. Yes, he throws curveballs, but his defense is his defense. He's tried and true with that. And big moments in that Denver game, guys, they got beat. You know, whether it's switching to man coverage in the second half, even though his secondary was paper thin, the inability to get the most out of your defensive line, which Brandon Beane has continued to pour resources into over the years to give him the guys that you should need to get to the opposing quarterback. They have not gotten a sack in a playoff loss since 2020 when Jerry Hughes took down a quarterback. That is far too long. And I do wonder if Sean McDermott might have been challenged that, hey, like, what are you going to do about your defense? Would you consider taking on a more CEO type of head coaching role? Because he is an incredible leader. He had the respect of all those players. He did not lose that locker room whatsoever, but something had to change. And I just wonder if that played a factor in it, because in the end, Brandon Beane had to have expressed a very clear vision to how to build this team, and based on, a couple of the sources I've talked to in recent weeks, Sean McDermott, when it came to the draft in particular, scouts would present players that they saw as very talented, but Sean McDermott had this guy doesn't have a skill set that I think we need for this position. We need to go here. And that really can box a GM a little bit. Now, Brandon Beane needs to own all the misses at wide receiver since the Stephon Diggs trade, right? There have been far too many. This team has not gotten enough impact players out of free agency either. But in the end, I think when you're looking across the league and you look at the last 4 teams remaining in the playoffs, guys, this Bills defense does not stack up with them. I think that he found a way to get the most out of some of his players, and there is a character and a resiliency that he really instilled in those players that just shows that Sean McDermott is going to be an effective head coach elsewhere. I have no doubt about it. But for this group, with this window and these circumstances, I totally see why Terry Pegula did the unexpected and pulled this lever.
Katherine, before I throw it over to you, I feel like Lance presents a sort of an interesting chicken or the egg scenario there, right, along the defensive line, because while I fully agree that the defensive line has not given this team enough, you kind of look at it and say, well, is the chef just not a good cook, or is he dealing with really bad recipe or, a bad recipe or bad ingredients here? And what I mean by that is, is Brandon Beane giving Sean McDermott the right players along that defensive line? And the Bills simply aren't getting enough out of them, whether that be from coaching, right? Position coaches or starting with Sean McDermott. That to me is a really interesting topic that we will kind of examine fully here as we move forward. I have been interested, though, by the reaction that I've seen amongst Bills fans today. And again, it's been, we've been so busy. We've had our heads down in our laptops, typing away here, working on stories and things like that. But for a lot of what I've seen, Katherine, has been the Bills fired the wrong guy, right? And that, people thought it would have been Brandon Beane, as you mentioned at the start, or people thought maybe that it even should have been Brandon Beane. How much have you seen that reaction, and do you feel like that's a fair assessment, Katherine?
I would say it's the leading reaction I've been seeing just from my survey of social media, or even just talking to people around Buffalo during very brief breaks from working. Been working a lot. But I would say what interests me more is the player reactions. We haven't seen every player weigh in, of course. It's been more defense than offense, most certainly. But players seem very in support of McDermott. And very shocked by the news, weighing in on how he's changed the culture here, on how players saying that he's the best coach they've ever had. And so I think to hear that amount of shock from the players is something that stands out to me a little more versus the fan base.
Yeah. Lance, I want to present this question to you. It's one that was kind of brought up to me that I do find a little bit interesting. And as I had mentioned, your previous experience on the Sabres beat, do you feel like in any way Pegula, seeing what happened with the change that he made with the Sabres and how it sort of sparked something, at least in them, and it's been obviously a small sample size here in the short term, but do you wonder if, that experience maybe led him to be a little bit more bold here and saying, the results have not been what we've needed them to be, really for 9 years, but in particularly these last 6, Allen's prime when he became, MVP candidate Josh Allen, and not being able to get over the hump. And so I guess the question is, do you feel like because he's seen the results that a change made with the Sabres, that maybe made him more willing? And again, I understand here I'm asking you to get inside the brain of Terry Pegula, which is not very easy since, we don't ever hear from him. But I wonder if any of that factors in here. What do you think on that?
Absolutely. I mean, for several years, I would say that Terry Pegula exercised extreme patience. He tried to. Earlier in his tenure as Sabres owner in particular, he was not afraid to fire people. He was not afraid to pay people not to work. But when he installed Kevin Adams as general manager in 2020, he decided it's time to take a step back. I installed somebody's general manager I trust implicitly, and I'm going to let him do the job. Yes, I want him to do the job within the confines or within the plan that we had talked about and the vision that I think is going to work for this hockey team. But I'm going to trust him. I'm going to step back and let's see how this goes. He gave Kevin Adams 5 years. Yeah. So when I was looking at the Bill situation, I thought he's going to be as patient here, right? But I think going back to last spring, Jay, when there was clearly going to be a significant shakeup with the Sabres in their front office, Terry Pegula and Pete Coelho set out to find a senior advisor to help Kevin Adams, and it ended up being Jarmo Kekalainen. And I think going through that process and then seeing the significant results of a very drastic move that Terry was really trying not to make for the last couple of years, yes, I think that empowered him to be more bold. And he has a general manager, for the moves that Brandon Beane has made that have not worked out. And mostly I'm looking right at that wide receiver room in particular. The ones on defense are very difficult to evaluate because of the McDermott piece of this and his scheme. And, and that goes for every coach around the league. Defensive minded coaches, whether 3-4, 4-3, whatever that setup is, they want specific players. And it's difficult to really pinpoint, is this GM, is it scouts, is it coach? But I think in the end, Brandon Beane was able to express a plan, perhaps even who he has an idea of to hire. That this was a tough year for the Bills, from the injuries inflicted on Josh Allen. Josh Allen played through injuries. He got hit more. He turned the ball over more. There was all those injuries on defense, so many of them during practice, guys, which really makes you wonder from a coaching standpoint. And the decision to fire the head strength coach after last season, a head strength coach, by the way, who is very widely respected by players. Like, I also wonder if that played a factor, not only in this, but the decision to elevate Brandon Beane in a role where he oversees all the football operations. So whoever the next coach is can't make a change to the head strength coach, for example. And this is more of a lockstep operation where the GM and the owner have more of more of a say over everything. It's a different leadership structure. I'm very curious to hear from Brandon Beane, and we're not going to hear from Terry Pegula realistically, but it would be interesting to hear his side of things.
Yeah, Katherine, before we move on to the next segment, and that is, what comes next for this franchise. You've been around Sean McDermott a long time. I've got some final thoughts that I'll share, but just wanted to open the floor to you if there was anything else you wanted to add on the topic here.
Oh, big question. I mean, I think, I hit on the players before because I think such a critical factor here is that McDermott did not lose this locker room. Yeah. I think that's, to Lance's point, I think he's going to be successful in his next steps, wherever that is. But, it was interesting, I would say, seeing his growth over the years. Jay, you can touch on that even more than I can, just being here longer. But we saw McDermott evolve during his tenure with the Bills. And I think just, his care for the city and the community went a long way in how people are feeling today. And I think that's what you're seeing a lot of the fan reaction of just knowing that, even if he did not get them to their ultimate goal, it wasn't for lack of care.
100%. And I'm really glad that you brought it up because there's a human element to this. And we have all established, varying degrees of relationships with Sean McDermott in covering him. And I can say without question that Sean McDermott is a good man. He is a champion of Buffalo that the Bills have not seen at head coach. I would argue maybe ever. I did not cover Marv Levy, and I know Marv Levy is the only coach in franchise history with more wins. Sean McDermott will leave with the best win percentage as a head coach in Bills history. We have to remember where this franchise was before he got here and the 17-year playoff drought and the immense role that he played in turning this team around. And yes, ultimately he did not get them to their ultimate goal, that being the Super Bowl. But that should not in any way take away from the job that he did and the reason that I think he should be celebrated for what he accomplished here in Buffalo in a lot of different ways. full disclosure, I reached out to Sean today. He sent back a very, very heartfelt message, and that's just the type of person that he is. I think anyone that has dealt with him personally or professionally has left with nothing but good things to say. And I fully expect, as you guys have said here, that he's going to land on his feet. He's going to do good things wherever he goes. There are 7 current head coach openings around the NFL outside of Buffalo. I would expect fully that Sean McDermott will be a candidate in one or maybe many of those cities. Again, we can kind of debate the merits of why this decision was made, whether it was right or whether it was wrong, but to not address the human element and the personal side, I think would be a mistake. So it's been a pleasure to cover him, honestly, for 9 years, and I think we all can say that he's done some, he did some darn good things here. As the NFL, though, as we know in the NFL world, it is a very cutthroat business, and as we move into our second segment here in just a minute, we will discuss what's next for the Buffalo Bills.
Harry the Hammer goes to work.
Harry the Hammer here from House Crafters, and I am one happy hammer. We just finished this addition and kitchen, and it's beautiful. Look at this place. It's gorgeous. If you have a remodeling project in mind, a kitchen, bathroom, or mother-in-law apartment, one call really does do it all at House Crafters. For a free estimate, call House Crafters at 646-NAIL.
Katherine, one of your pieces today at the Buffalo News is looking at what is next for the Bills in terms of head coaching candidates. And, we have seen the names kind of thrown around out there on social media. We know who some of the candidates are in this current cycle for NFL head coaching jobs. If you want, Katherine, maybe just go down the list, include, some of the names that you came up with for that piece in the Buffalo News, and then we can kind of bat around some of those ideas from there.
For sure. And we'll be updating our story on buffalonews.com as we hear more about who's interviewing, what their resumes are. But, to start with an internal look, I do think the Bills will talk to Joe Brady, their offensive coordinator, who has been interviewing with other openings around the NFL for their head coaching position. I think, we'll hear more later this week from the team and from Josh Allen himself, but he's going to have a say in this decision. And so I think the relationship with Allen is something to keep in mind, which brings me to another candidate, Brian Daboll, former OC of the Bills, fired by the New York Giants this season, grew up in Western New York, loves the area, but that relationship with Josh Allen, again, is going to be so key. Allen has spoken very highly of Daboll since his departure, losing record as head coach of the New York Giants, but I think what he's able to do with an offense is going to get him some looks here in Buffalo. 2 more candidates I'll mention before we kind of open it up to everyone in the world. Clint Kubiak, offensive coordinator of the Seattle Seahawks, and Davis Webb, former Buffalo Bill, who is now with the Denver Broncos. I mention both of these guys because the Bills can't talk to them yet. Per the rule changes around the hiring cycle, the Bills can't talk to them until their teams are done, whether they lose next week or go on to the Super Bowl. So it'll be a bit before the Bills could talk to either of those candidates. But I would expect each of them to get a look as well.
Lance, before I throw it to you, I will say that I think this is a fascinating job opening. You could argue the best in the NFL, maybe with the exception of the Ravens, which is, they're also in a situation where they have a franchise quarterback in Lamar Jackson. That is a very rock-solid franchise in many ways, too. Katherine mentioned Josh Allen having a say in this, and I am very interested in that. My opinion on this is that it goes one of 2 ways. The Bills either hire a head coach with a Super Bowl pedigree, meaning a Super Bowl win on his resume or at least an appearance, or the opposite of that, or I guess the other direction I could see it going, is a bright, young, offensive-minded head coach. Some of the candidates that Katherine mentioned there certainly fit that bill. What do you think, Lance? Where do you see this going? Or maybe, instead of predicting what they're going to do, what do you think they should do?
Well, we usually see it when a team fires a head coach. We usually see them go to the opposite side of the ball. If the Bills do that, they should, whoever they hire, whether it's Brady, Daboll, Kubiak, they should, if they go that route, it's okay, well, who are you bringing in as a defensive coordinator? Let's make sure it's somebody experienced and let them handle that side of the ball, right? And it is difficult to, anytime you make a coaching change, because you have to, how much is scheme fit going to make it? How is that going to factor into your decision? Because you draft, like the Bills invested a lot in this defense in terms of draft capital, and you don't want a bunch of players who don't fit whoever you hire. So that is another factor to consider. And is it going to be somebody with a head coaching experience? Are they going to go with somebody who's never been a head coach before, like Joe Brady, right? I mean, Joe Brady, no head coaching experience at any level, but he would win over the locker room immediately. And if you bring in Joe Brady, what's his vision for the defense? Is he going to call his own plays? That is another factor. You know, it's so many of these coaches in their first head gig, they try to call plays while being the head guy, and it doesn't work out. So what would his plan be? Could you hire Brady and pair him with somebody like Webb? That is a question that I have. And is somebody like Mike McDaniel going to be a candidate in Buffalo? No, it didn't work in Miami from, I think, a leadership standpoint was Mike McDaniel's blind spot. But I agree with you wholeheartedly, Jay. This is the most attractive opening right now. I'm sure if you're Kevin Stefanski, who's going off to Atlanta, you wish that you would have held off a couple of days to get a chance to coach Josh Allen. There's going to be a wealth of interest. I'm curious from your perspective, Jay. You covered Brian Daboll. You've been around him a lot. You saw those Bills offenses with Daboll running the show. I've just watched from afar, including his time with the New York Giants, and I did have concerns about just how much of a beating his quarterbacks took. I'm curious from your perspective, if I think that he has all the leadership skills. He is somebody who could pick up that baton in terms of culture and run with it, and there wouldn't be a huge drop-off. But from your perspective, why would Daboll be somebody who should be at the top of the list in terms of candidates?
Well, the short answer to that is the relationship with Allen. He got the best out of Josh Allen. Josh Allen played the absolute best football of his career under Brian Daboll, and they are exceptionally close. They've remained exceptionally close. This would be obviously a dream job for Brian Daboll. I think there was a very strong case that could have been made after the 13 seconds playoff loss that was the time to do it. That was the time to move on from Sean McDermott. That was, without question, I think, stain on his resume that will stay with him from his time with the Bills. And I don't know that he ever truly overcame that. I don't know that people ever forgot it. It was going to take a Super Bowl for people to forget that performance from Josh Allen being wasted. And I think wasted is the right word because of the coaching at the end of that game against the Chiefs. And so I remember well that, that was the plan, or the hope amongst many people was that if they were going to move on from Sean McDermott, just make Brian Daboll the head coach at that time. Now, things have been complicated, right? Daboll goes to New York, and he has a terrific first season. In many ways, it mirrored Sean McDermott coming to Buffalo, in that he goes in, he wins over the fan base, he makes the playoffs, really somewhat unexpectedly, advances to the divisional round. The Giants had been kind of a mess for a while before Joe Shane and Brian Daboll get there, and he has this terrific run of success. Where they screwed up was they did not get a quarterback. They invested in Daniel Jones. He couldn't stay healthy. His performance regressed. They never did what they needed to do and what they did in Buffalo, and that was follow the playbook of drafting and developing a young quarterback. Well, Brian Daboll undoubtedly has as much to do with Josh Allen developing into a superstar in this league as any coach does. I would say he probably is the most impactful coach in that regard. Daboll finally gets his chance in New York this year with Jackson Dart, but at that point it was too far gone, right? The franchise had lost too much. The fan base just became too unsettled by the sheer number of losses that they took. And to your point, they weren't able to protect Dart. Well, Allen took a lot of sacks when he was a younger, kind of more reckless player too. And eventually, he got to the point where he didn't do that. I think Daboll would be a fine hire. I think, clearly the relationship with Allen would be in a good place from day one. I think there would be reason to believe that the offense would continue to function at a very high level. I agree that he would have the respect of the room, but it comes with some significant questions, and that is just how did things get away from them in New York as badly as they did. And I think that would be the big concern is what did you take away from that experience in New York that is going to make things different here in Buffalo? Katherine, what do you spent some time around Daboll, as we know him here. He's obviously a terrific guy. I mean, as I said, this would be a dream job for him, but it doesn't come without some risk. And before you touch on that, I would say that you can address this too. This is a high pressure job. Whoever is hired into this job is not going to have much runway in terms of, okay, well, you can go 6-11 in your first year or 7-10, and it's going to be okay. You're going to be expected to come in and win a Super Bowl, and pretty much immediately. And so, while I agree with Lance that it's an attractive opening because of Allen, it also comes with a unique, I hate when people use the word unique when in the wrong way, an unusual set of challenges in that the expectations are going to be so high. So maybe start there, Katherine, and then if you had anything on Daboll as a candidate that you wanted to add, you can jump into that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting dynamic where this is an attractive opening, but that pressure is real. I think the message Terry Pegula is sending with firing Sean McDermott, keeping Brandon Beane, promoting Brandon Beane, is that this team, Super Bowl or bust, basically. There's not going to be much leeway for the next coach to come in and have kind of that learning curve, which I think eliminates some people that they might look at. Daboll, I think, is a fascinating case where that relationship with Allen's going to be so important. I wonder what they would then do at defensive coordinator. But, I think I'll be curious to hear from Josh Allen later this week. He wanted some time to decompress before talking postseason. And now the sign's up with asking him about the coaching vacancy, just about kind of, how much say he thinks he'll have in it. We know that Lamar Jackson is having say in Baltimore. So what do they do here in Buffalo? I think will be really interesting.
It's a great question, and it's one I'll give to you, Lance. I think that the Bills are walking a fine line here with that in terms of, obviously, I don't think this move gets made today, firing Sean McDermott, without Josh Allen knowing about it beforehand, and I would say probably being on board with it. I wouldn't say, Josh Allen demanding it or anything like that, but I would think that if Josh Allen were like, absolutely not, that's the worst thing that you could do, I wonder if it happens. There is a point, though, where the quarterback, it's his job to play quarterback. It isn't to run the draft. It isn't to have a significant say in coaching hires. You want him to have an opinion. I believe that. And to get his feedback. He is the most important person in the organization. I get it. But Josh Allen wanted Keon Coleman. We've seen how that's gone, right? And so what do you make of that, Lance? How involved should Allen be in this situation?
I think it should be similar to what Baltimore is planning with Lamar Jackson, where they're going to bring in Lamar for the second round of interviews. We'll keep you updated along the way. We're going to bring you in. You're free to ask questions. If you wholeheartedly object to somebody that is going to be our top candidate, we will absolutely consider that, and that's going to weigh heavily in our decision. But in the end, Brandon Beane's going to be making the call on who the next coach is. I think, to me, the bigger factor in who you hire, Jay, is what's their plan in terms of building a staff? Because this isn't just about one person. Who's going to be your OC? Who's going to be your defense coordinator? This team has, cap flexibility is not exactly flush for the Buffalo Bills entering this offseason. They have a lot of work to do. Brandon Beane's got a lot of work to do this spring, with the free agents they have possibly walking out the door, a draft where you have to hit on these picks. You've got positions of need that have to be addressed here. So really, to me, Jay, it's about what is your vision for this team? Like, they trust Josh Allen. Like, of course, we want to hear what Allen has to say, but what's your plan here, right? Like, and I think that's, we talk about Brian Daboll and some of the concerns he'll absolutely need to address in his interview, because he's going to get one. Like, we would be shocked if he didn't. But I think all of these candidates are in the same bucket. With Joe Brady, it's, you don't have head coaching experience. How are you going to transition from an assistant coach to being the head guy, where there's a different dynamic there in terms of leadership? What are you going to do about play calling? What are you going to do about hiring a staff, since you don't have that much experience? Before we brought you here as a quarterbacks coach, a short stint as OC with the Carolina Panthers, but his background was in college. And then it's Clint Kubiak, no head coaching experience. Even Mike McDaniel, it was kind of a circus down there in Miami at times. What went wrong and how are you going to address it? So I think there isn't a perfect candidate out there. So who fits best with the Buffalo Bills? And and I think that is another factor in this, guys, where Brandon Beane knows he's got a very good pulse on what would be best for the Buffalo Bills, and the scouts that he brought in that found a lot of good players mid to late round. But he has to hit a home run here. He's only going to get one swing of the bat at this, you would think, just based on how this has gone, and Josh Allen being 30 at the start of next season. So going to have a lot of interest. You just got to make the right decision.
McDaniel scares the daylights out of me. Everything I heard about McDaniel in Miami and culture just didn't sound good. I mean,
the
I
culture
understand.
piece of it's a big one.
And that's what they've got. That's what's worked here. That is what's worked, right? They have that. And so that is a big time risk for me. Go ahead, Katherine. I had to get that off my chest real quick.
No, I think that was important to say. I agree with Lance's point that, the next coach here has a short leash, but Brandon Beane also has one chance to get this right.
One of the things that I think is really interesting about this hire, and it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about the immediate pressure for whoever it is to win, is that inevitably this guy, as you said, Lance, whether it's we're going to operate on the assumption that it's an offensive-minded head coach. He's going to put in a defensive coordinator of his choosing. There's going to be roster turnover here. There was going to be anyway, just because of the sheer number of free agents. But when you think about, like, schematically, how many of these players on the current roster fit, a reality in the NFL is that when a new head coach comes in and installs his coaching staff, the players that they look for are inevitably different. So that's going to be a challenge in that, you may be potentially changing schemes, perhaps drastically, and then having to win right away with those players, because that pressure will be there. And so you do wonder in terms of, will Brandon Beane look for a coach who maybe doesn't want to rock the boat entirely because, of all of these players that they've, spent the last few years drafting and developing. It's going to be tough if a guy comes in and says, I've got no use for Keon Coleman, and I think Greg Rousseau was a mistake as an extension, and Terrell Bernard as your defensive captain, he doesn't fit the kind of defense that I want to play. Well, for a team that has as many free agents as it does, has several key questions, whether it be at wide receiver, whether it be at who's going to start at safety, who's going to play defensive line, who's going to play middle linebacker, to add a new head coach, potentially new coordinators, and potentially new schemes onto that is putting a lot on the plate of who ultimately ends up getting this job.
I couldn't agree more. And you got to consider, and that is another reason why they're going to talk to defensive coaches too, defensive candidates, because it is difficult to find exact scheme fit, Jay, but you can get as close as you can. They're not going to go to like a 3-4, for example. That is, especially with the financial ramifications, they can't handle it. And that is going to be part of the interview questioning in terms of who are you bringing in, what's the drop off going to be. And I think that it does probably help. It bolsters, I think, Brady and Daboll's cases because they're so familiar with the personnel that's already in the building, not only in terms of what you can do on the field, but from a leadership standpoint. Who is most important to the operation here? I think that also is going to help them.
A lot of questions certainly to come in the days ahead. No time off in the foreseeable future for yours truly and my colleagues here, Lance and Katherine. Sincerely appreciate you guys taking some time out of what was a busy day to trade podcast teams, at least momentarily, here at BuffaloNews.com and joining us at the Further Review podcast. So for Lance and for Katherine, my name is Jay Skursky. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to read all of our coverage here on what has been a very busy day for the Buffalo Bills at BuffaloNews.com.
This is Harry the Hammer for Further Review by Housecrafters. Housecrafters provides complete home renovation services with one call does it all. That includes interior home services as well as windows and doors. Call 716-646-NAIL.